The road stretched quiet, framed by the glow of fading daylight. Harold Benton guided his car down State Highway 67 with the patience of a man who had lived long enough to appreciate calm. His hands rested lightly on the wheel, his thoughts wandering to his daughter, to the book waiting on his nightstand, to the simple rituals of a life he had earned. But in the rearview mirror, serenity dissolved into chaos. Red and blue lights pierced the stillness, demanding his submission. He eased the car onto the shoulder, careful not to make sudden movements. His pulse quickened, though his face remained calm. Decades of experience had prepared him for this dance, the unspoken rules of survival. Keep your hands visible, don't reach too quickly. Speak slowly, if at all. For Harold, this was not paranoia, but muscle memory, carved into him by years of living in a world that measured him differently. The cruiser's door slammed shut, and Officer Travis Cole emerged with a presence sharp enough to cut the night in two. His boots hit the pavement like a metronome of power. The flashlight beam carved a white streak across Harold's face, resting long enough to reduce him to an object under inspection. Cole's tone was clipped, sharp, impatient. He wanted license, registration, answers, now. Harold's response was calm, deliberate, wrapped in the dignity of a man who knew the law better than his accuser. But calmness was gasoline to Cole's fire. Where the officer sought nervousness, he found composure. Where he demanded haste, he met patience. Each second Harold remained steady was an insult to the fragile authority Cole was desperate to assert. Accusations piled on, reckless driving, suspicious behavior, empty claims hurled like stones against a wall. Harold did not argue. He knew better than to feed flames with words. Yet the silence itself began to weigh heavier than any defiance. To Cole, it was insolence. To Harold, it was the last shield of dignity. The tension coiled tight. Cole's voice rose into shouts, his hand hovering near his holster as if a frail elder in a car posed imminent danger. He demanded Harold step out. Harold remained still, not as rebellion, but as refusal to bow under false power. His silence became a statement. Across the asphalt, headlights slowed. A passerby lifted a phone, the lens capturing a moment too common and too dangerous to ignore. The camera trembled slightly, yet what it recorded was history unfolding. An elder standing quietly against the storm of authority. Cole's patience snapped. With a jerk, he yanked the car door open. His hands gripped Harold with force that belied the frailty of his target. The old man's body stumbled against the assault, wrists twisted until steel cuffs locked around them. The night air filled with the clatter of authority, the humiliation of a man reduced not by guilt, but by prejudice. Harold said nothing. His silence weighed heavier than screams. It carried the quiet fury of generations who had stood in his place. In the glare of flashing lights, he was no longer just Harold Benton, retired judge, father, elder. He was a mirror of a system's injustice, framed by sirens and concrete, his dignity forced into chains yet unbroken. What began as a traffic stop had become an indictment of something far larger. And though Harold stood in silence, the world would soon find his voice in the recording captured by trembling hands on the side of State Highway 67. Harold Benton's story began in Riverton during the decline of America's industrial heartland. He was born into a city dominated by steel mills, where long shifts and dangerous work defined the rhythm of daily life. His father labored in the factory until injury forced him into early retirement. His mother worked nights in a nursing home, moving from one patient to the next with little rest. Survival was a constant negotiation, and for a black family in Riverton, opportunity was rare. From a young age, Harold understood that expectations for him were minimal. Schools in his neighborhood were underfunded, classrooms overcrowded, and teachers often assumed children like him would end up in the same factories as their parents. Yet Harold distinguished himself quietly. While others drifted toward the same patterns of work and struggle, he spent hours in the public library, reading legal histories and biographies of leaders who challenged the boundaries of their time. Books offered him not just escape, but direction. By the late 1960s, the civil rights movement had begun to leave its mark on the Midwest. Riverton saw its own share of marches and protests, though smaller than those in major cities. Harold joined them, not at the front but among the students who carried signs through streets lined with jeering bystanders. These moments shaped his belief that change required persistence more than spectacle. College marked his first true break from Riverton's confines. Few expected him to succeed, and fewer welcomed his presence. Professors questioned whether he belonged, classmates underestimated him, and the isolation was constant. Yet Harold excelled through steady effort. Law school carried the same challenges, but by then his resilience was firmly set. Each dismissal he encountered only reinforced his resolve to move forward. When he entered the profession, Harold chose cases that spoke to fairness rather than profit. As an attorney, he was meticulous and deliberate. Later, as a professor, he became known for his clarity of thought, his ability to teach principles of justice without rhetoric. Eventually, his career took him to the bench, where his judgments reflected balance and discipline. He avoided grandstanding, preferring to let his rulings speak for themselves. Despite his success, Harold never left Riverton. The city was marked by economic decline, racial division, and the remnants of industrial collapse, but it remained his anchor. To him, leaving would have meant abandoning the sacrifices his parents had made. His decision to stay was less about comfort and more about responsibility, to stand where he had begun and to represent the possibility of progress in a place resistant to it. Decades later, that same city would turn against him on the side of a road. For Officer Travis Cole, Harold's years of work, his rulings, and his reputation mattered little. In that moment, history repeated itself in the most personal way. A man who had spent his life inside courtrooms, upholding the structure of law, was reduced to a suspect under flashing lights. The irony was unmistakable. Harold Benton had built a career proving that justice could be fair, that the system could deliver dignity. Yet standing under the glare of headlights with his hands bound, he embodied the truth he had known since childhood. The struggle for equality was never past tense. The patrol car carried Harold Benton through the city like a vessel of humiliation. The cuffs tightened against his skin, and each vibration of the engine seemed to echo in his chest. Outside the window, Riverton blurred by, the same streets where he had once walked to school, the same courthouse steps he had climbed in his robe, the same library where he had discovered law in brittle old books. Every landmark became a reflection, reminding him of how far he had come and how swiftly he had been reduced to nothing in the eyes of one officer. He closed his eyes briefly, retreating inward. Memories surfaced unbidden. His mother's voice urging him to rise above the limits imposed on him. His father's bent figure returning from the mill, teaching without words that survival demanded endurance. His first day in law school, where a professor had dismissed his presence with a smirk, and the day he had taken the oath as a judge, the weight of responsibility pressing heavier than the robe itself. Each memory pressed against the reality of the cuffs on his wrists, colliding past and present in painful symmetry. At the station, the lights were harsh, stripping away any sense of humanity. Cole's voice was loud, sharp, filling the room with accusations. He described Harold as uncooperative, dangerous, even threatening. The words were not just false, they were designed to erase the man's entire history. To those listening, Harold was no longer a scholar or a judge. He was a problem to be processed, a body to be contained. The booking process unfolded with mechanical precision. Fingerprints, photographs, forms, each step methodical, each one another act of erasure. Harold felt the flash of the camera like a blade, cutting away the dignity he had carried for decades. He thought of the countless defendants who had stood under that same light, their stories unheard, their truth reduced to paperwork. Tonight, he was one of them. Cole lingered, feeding on Harold's silence. He leaned closer, speaking words not meant for the record, taunts, slurs, challenges meant to provoke. But Harold remained unmoved. His silence was not resignation. It was the last defense he had left. He would not let Cole steal what his parents had given him, what his life had proven, a dignity that did not depend on anyone's permission. The cell was cold, its walls rough with age. Harold sat on the bench, the chains now removed but their weight still present on his wrists. Around him, younger men watched with curiosity. Some recognized him, whispering his name. Their disbelief was heavy. To them, he had been a figure of authority, a symbol of fairness. To see him behind bars was to see the fragility of the very system he once represented. Alone in that silence, Harold thought of legacy. He wondered how the city would remember him, not as a man who lectured about justice, but as a man dragged from his car. Yet beneath the sting of humiliation, he felt something steadier. The truth was not contained in these walls. It lived in memory, in witness, in the recording made by a stranger who had refused to look away. And so Harold waited. He had fought many battles in courts, but this one was different. Here, words would not save him. Time would. Exposure would. The truth, once seen, could not be buried again. In that certainty, he found his strength. The video spread like fire on dry grass. By dawn, phones across Riverton lit up with the same grainy clip. An old man dragged from his car, his face lit by headlights, his silence defying the officer's shouts. People replayed it again and again, shaking their heads, their voices rising in disbelief. For many, it was not just another video. It was their city, their judge, their neighbor. The first to gather were students. By midday, they filled the steps of the courthouse with handwritten signs and candles in glass jars. They chanted his name, their voices carrying across downtown streets. Strangers joined them, workers leaving shifts, parents with children, church groups holding banners. The courthouse lawn became a sea of faces, lit by flickering flames and the rising rhythm of voices calling for justice. News cameras arrived, their lenses capturing the chants that rolled like thunder through Riverton's narrow streets. Footage of Harold in his robe, deliberate, calm, dignified, flashed across screens, immediately followed by the video of his arrest. The contrast was unbearable. Anchors spoke of hypocrisy, of failure, of a city forced to confront its reflection. The police department issued statements, each colder than the last. They spoke of procedure and safety, repeating words that no one believed. For the crowd outside, every denial only deepened the anger. Signs grew sharper. Dignity is not a crime. We are all Harold. Enough. The chants swelled, shaking the night air. On the third night, the protests spread beyond the courthouse. Marches wound through Main Street, past shuttered factories and boarded windows. Car horns blared in support. Windows opened as residents leaned out, raising fists or joining the chants. What had begun as a circle of students had grown into thousands. The city's heartbeat was no longer silence. It was footsteps, drums, and voices rising together. Riverton had not seen unity like this in decades. Communities long divided found themselves side by side. Young and old, students and workers, families and strangers, all carried Harold's image printed on posters, held high above the crowd. His silence in the video had become their rallying cry, proof that dignity could be louder than rage. Inside the station, Officer Travis Cole stayed hidden from sight. But his name traveled faster than he could escape. His photograph appeared on posters, online feeds, news reports. Some demanded his firing, others his trial. His absence only fed the fury outside. By the end of the week, Riverton was transformed. The courthouse steps glowed each night with candles that never burned out. Downtown streets echoed with chants until dawn. For once, the city's voices refused to fade. And in the heart of it all, without speaking a word, Harold Benton had become a symbol. His silence was no longer just his own. It belonged to thousands, and it had turned a single moment on a dark highway into the loudest cry Riverton had ever heard. Inside City Hall, the walls felt thinner with every chant that echoed from the streets below. Meetings stretched long into the night, but none ended with answers. The mayor sat at the head of the table, his voice tight, repeating the same lines about order and procedure, yet his eyes betrayed unease. Riverton was slipping out of his hands, and he knew it. The footage of Harold Benton's arrest had become a national scandal. Every major network played it side by side with his years on the bench, the contrast damning. Editorials spoke of hypocrisy, of a system that devoured its own. For the first time in decades, Riverton's name was on front pages not for factories or sports, but for injustice. The police chief tried to reassure the council. He insisted his officers had followed protocol, that the department had nothing to hide. But each new statement was met with louder protests outside. The more officials spoke, the less anyone believed. Each denial sounded like an admission. Each attempt at control fueled more anger. Officer Travis Cole remained out of sight, placed on administrative leave. His absence was supposed to calm the city, but it only sharpened resentment. His name appeared on placards, his face on posters plastered across brick walls downtown. In the silence, he became a ghost, accused of holding the match that set Riverton ablaze. By midweek, barricades surrounded not just the police station, but City Hall itself. Patrol cars lined the streets, their lights washing the night in red and blue. Inside, officials debated curfews, emergency orders, the possibility of calling in the National Guard. But each suggestion carried risks. Too little action, and the protests would grow. Too heavy a hand, and the city might explode. Meanwhile, the crowds outside thickened. Students filled the courthouse lawn, clergy held vigils in the square, workers marched after their shifts. What united them was not just anger at Harold's arrest, but the memory of every injustice Riverton had buried under silence. The chants outside were not asking anymore, they were demanding. The first confrontation arrived on Friday. Officers stood in a line outside the station, shields raised, their visors reflecting the fire of candles and torches in the crowd. The air trembled with tension. When a banner bearing Harold's name was hoisted above the barricades, officers surged forward to tear it down. The crowd erupted, pressing against the shields, voices rising in defiance. A bottle shattered on the pavement, and in the next instant, the night filled with smoke. Smoke filled the square, scattering the crowd. The city that officials had sworn was under control now looked like a clash. Cameras captured it all. The smoke, the screams, the faces of protesters refusing to back down. By dawn, headlines declared Riverton a city in crisis. Officials insisted the situation was contained, but no one believed them. The footage told a different story. A city at war with itself, its leaders barricaded behind glass while the streets outside roared with voices they could no longer silence. And in the middle of it all, Harold Benton sat in his cell. He had spoken no words, yet his silence had undone the city's leaders more than any speech could. His stillness was a weight none of them could control. It pressed against the walls of City Hall, against the gates of the police station, against the hollow reassurances of men in suits. Riverton was no longer listening to its officials. It was listening to itself. Behind the chants in the streets, another kind of storm was brewing. One fought not with banners and voices, but with memos, calls, and closed-door meetings. Riverton's officials found themselves trapped between the swelling fury outside and the crumbling foundation of their own authority. What began as a traffic stop had become a trial before the court of public opinion, and the city's leaders knew the formal trial would soon follow. In the county courthouse, the air hung heavy. Judges moved briskly through hallways, avoiding reporters who pressed microphones at every corner. Prosecutors whispered in corners, their voices low, weighing not just evidence, but consequences. To press charges against Harold Benton would mean legitimizing Officer Cole's account, and with every passing day, that account looked more like a liability than a defense. Internal memos leaked to the press revealed cracks in the official story. Cole's report claimed erratic driving, yet traffic cameras showed an empty stretch of road. He wrote of non-compliance, but witnesses described calm restraint. Each revelation deepened the sense that the case was built not on fact, but on presumption and prejudice. The police union doubled down, insisting Cole had acted within protocol. Their statement was firm, rehearsed, unyielding. But even within the department, whispers grew louder. Some officers admitted privately that the stop was reckless, that Cole had pushed too far. Loyalty to the badge clashed with the fear of being swept under by his arrogance. At the university where Harold had once taught, faculty gathered to draft letters of support. Lawyers, some his former students, volunteered to defend him. Legal scholars published op-eds dissecting every angle, calling the case a test of Riverton's integrity. The courtroom was no longer just a venue, It was becoming a stage on which the city's values would be judged before the nation. Behind closed doors, the mayor and council argued late into the night. Some pushed for dismissal of charges, others feared that doing so would be seen as weakness. Yet the longer they delayed, the more the streets outside filled with voices demanding action. Each hesitation was another spark tossed into an already spreading fire. And in the center of it all, Harold Benton remained silent. He did not request interviews. He did not release statements. His restraint carried more force than any defense attorney's argument. The silence, once used against him, now echoed as indictment, not of him, but of the system that placed him in chains. As the date for his preliminary hearing approached, the city braced. Courtrooms were being cleared for overflow seating, barricades prepared for inevitable crowds. National outlets confirmed they would broadcast the proceedings live. What had begun as an arrest on the shoulder of Highway 67 was now set to become a trial of Riverton itself. The officials knew it. The people knew it. And though Harold had yet to speak a single word, everyone understood. When he finally did, it would not be the voice of one man, but of a generation demanding to be heard. By the end of the month, Riverton had been transformed. What had begun as a single video of an old man pulled from his car had turned into weeks of marches, vigils, and confrontation. Yet unlike many cities before, Riverton's story did not end in silence. It ended in accountability. The courtroom was packed when Harold Benton's case was finally heard. Students sat shoulder to shoulder with church leaders, neighbors with journalists, strangers with old friends who had known Harold for decades. They had come not only to witness a verdict, but to stand for a man who had stood for them all his life. The defense played the roadside video again. Every second of it spoke louder than words. An elder treated not with respect, but with contempt, accused without cause, cuffed without dignity. There was no argument the prosecution could make that survived the sight of that truth. When the charges were dismissed, the room erupted, not in chaos, but in relief. Harold closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the sound of justice finally aligning with truth. It was not triumph in the sense of conquest, but vindication, pure and simple. Outside, the streets filled again, but this time with celebration. Music rose from car radios, children ran with banners, families gathered in the square. Neighbors hugged one another saying, "He won, we all won." The courthouse steps, once a place of protest, became a place of joy. Harold stood among them, no podium, no cameras in his face, just people, his people. Former students shook his hand, reminding him of the lectures that had inspired them years before. Mothers pressed his palm, whispering gratitude. Teenagers who had never set foot in his classroom told him they wanted to study law because of him. The city that had once doubted him now embraced him. The steel mill streets where he had grown up, the neighborhoods that had seen him as an outsider, were now filled with murals of his face, painted by young artists who saw in him a symbol of endurance and strength. But Harold did not see himself as a hero. To him, this was not about personal glory. It was about the promise that had carried him from childhood poverty to the highest courts of the state, that justice, though often delayed, could still be won. That evening, when the candles were lit once more in the square, Harold walked among the people not as a prisoner, not even as a judge, but as a neighbor. His silence, once misinterpreted as weakness, was now understood for what it truly was, the strength of a man who refused to break. In the crowd, a child tugged at his mother's hand and pointed at Harold. "Who is he?" the boy asked. The mother smiled and said, "He's proof that they can't take our dignity away." Harold heard her words, and for the first time in many days, he allowed himself a soft laugh. The struggle was not over, but Riverton had changed, and in that change, he saw the victory that mattered most. Not headlines, not fame, but the knowledge that the next generation would walk a little taller because of what had been won here. And as the night filled with music and light, Harold Benton, once silenced, once shackled, walked home with dignity unbroken, his presence no longer questioned but honored. Names, characters, and incidents are products of imagination. Any resemblance to actual people is coincidental. Please like this video and subscribe to support our work. We are against all forms of violence and discrimination. Our goal is to highlight injustice so the world does not look away.
Stay.